Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Caregivers Grief, Loss, and Coping. My name is Allegra Jaffe, and I am a caregiver specialist with Fairfax Area Agency on Aging. You should have received an email this morning with the speaker slides, so you'll have them for future reference. We will also allocate a few minutes of time at the end of the presentation for you to submit your questions by typing into the question box on your panel. Today's presentation is being recorded, and a recording will be sent to all registrants by early next week. There will be a brief survey as you sign out, so please help us by giving us your feedback. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker and instructor, Colleen Turner. Colleen Turner is a licensed clinical social worker who has worked with older adults and their families for almost 20 years. Colleen has facilitated numerous caregiver support groups for the Alzheimer's Association of Washington, D.C. area, her church, and other county programs. Currently, Colleen serves older adults with anxiety, depression, and/or grief through her private practice with the Northern Virginia Older Adult Counseling Center. Colleen is going to share her expertise with us today. Thank you so much, Colleen, and welcome.
Thank you. Hi there. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and I very much appreciate this opportunity. We'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. Let's see if I can't get this for you. So, as Allegra said, I have done quite a bit of work. Let's see, make sure that it is showing and that you can see my screen. I'm hoping that's the case. So I have done quite a bit of work over the years with caregivers, and so I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you, because I think that grief for caregivers is unique, as we will describe. So the first thing I wanted to share with you was, and I don't know if this is showing on the side. See if I can make that go down. Nope. Okay, I just messed up. Sorry. Give me half a minute. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to go to this. So the side says, from Winnie the Pooh, how lucky I am to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard. And in fact, that really exemplifies what grief is like for caregivers, because as you know, caregiving is a huge challenge and often can feel like a burden when we're honest about it. It is difficult, and yet we hear over and over and over again, and I know I've experienced myself, that it is a rare privilege to be a caregiver, to be that connected to the people that we care for. I wanted to talk a little bit. I wish I could get rid of this. Let's see if I can. 1 second. I'll move you down there. Okay, great. So caregiver's loss is greatly impacted by the amount of investment that you have in your role as a caregiver and in your caregiving relationship. Having said that, I'm not talking about the difference between a long-distance caregiver and a day-to-day caregiver. I'm not talking about that kind of investment, because I know from experience that being a long-distance caregiver can be every bit as invested as any other caregiving relationship. It's just that the more that you have invested yourself in the caregiving role, in your caregiving relationship, the more that you have invested yourself, the greater the loss. That makes perfect sense to me. I'm sure it does to you too. The caregiver also has to deal with the physical loss, the real loss of the person that you have been providing care for, and what Pauline Boss in her book, Loving Someone with Dementia, describes as ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss where someone is gone, but not really gone. For example, someone who has dementia, who's still there in front of you, but the relationship has changed so much that it really is a loss. In that situation, the caregiver has to deal with that loss too, as well as the anticipatory loss as a caregiver, knowing and observing the care recipient in their decline. That's very hard as well. Emotionally, caregivers have to deal with the loss of sense. The sense of self. They have to deal with how much of their identity has been wrapped up in being a caregiver. And so, who are you now? In the same way, there's often a social loss when your social world has been about the doctors, the nurses, the support group, maybe the in-home specialists that have all been providing the team for caregiving. So losing that social interaction, that social connection, is also something that must now be addressed and redefined. Spiritually, many times, all grievers, not just caregivers, but all grievers ask, how could this happen? And it makes many people who believe that they have a firm foundation in their faith question that faith. How could this happen? We all know the question, how can bad things happen to good people? We'd like to think there's justice in all things and that it just won't happen. Another thing that people don't like to talk about, but it's very real, is a lot of times there is a financial loss for caregivers. They may not be able to stay in the home anymore, that if they were staying in the home of the care recipient. They may lose benefits that the care recipient, just by being there, was getting. So there can be a real significant financial loss for the caregiver as well that has to be addressed and looked at. I want to talk a minute now. I want to talk a little bit about afterlife and what we think about afterlife. I want you to know, I have my faith, I'm sure you do too, and I'm not really going to go there with you today. But what I'd like to do is to build a healing foundational view of life after death so that we can use that together. Then you feel free to add on your own theology to that. But I'd like to start with a kind of a more secular view. It's abstract, it's a little bit different, so bear with me. But I think if you really listen, you'll be able to hear this foundational view that we can all agree on. So the foundational view is basically based on a spirit, how we each have a spirit. And when I spirit, I don't mean like the ghost of past, present, and future Christmases that led Scrooge around. I'm not talking about an embodied spirit. What I'm talking about is something that's more like the spirit of the holidays. You know, the music, the tinsel, the gift buying, the snow, all of that, the joy, all of that creates a spirit of the holidays. And in the same way, we each create a spirit of who we are, right? Not a ghost. I'm not talking about that. And if you believe in that, again, that's yet your add-on. But foundationally, we can all agree that we each have a spirit of who we are that makes us unique. Things that I really like, things that would make me laugh, songs that I like to sing. Those are all parts of my spirit that makes me unique. Not my spirit embodied somehow, but the spirit of who I am. And so if you can hang on to that thought, that's the important one to recognize that lasts no matter what. I'm going to share a funny story with you. When my daughter was a teenager, we got into a huge fight. I know that's hard to imagine, but teens are teens. And she said, that's it. I'm leaving. I'm going to go stay with a friend. I'm not staying with you. I can't deal with you anymore. And I said to her, you know what? You can feel free to leave, but I've got some news for you. And that is, I'm your mother. And I'm your mother for the rest of your life. For the rest of your life, I'm going to be on your shoulder, talking into your ear, whether you like it or not. And I'm not even talking about for the rest of my life. I'm talking about for the rest of your life. As long as you're breathing, I'm going to be on your shoulder, whispering in your ear. That's the kind of spirit I'm talking about. That's the kind of spirit that we can hang on to, that we can build the legacy of the person that we've lost on in our remembrances. The reality is we are pack animals. Look at these beautiful lions. They are loving on each other. They are clearly attached. And we are made in the same way. We are made to attach. And so when that attachment is broken, it is extremely painful because we are not meant to detach. We are meant to attach. So that means we need to grieve. We need to grieve. And we want to grieve. I once went to meet with a man who was sitting alone in his living room when I arrived in his home. And he said, "My adult children keep calling me. They want me to go out and resume life without my wife. But they don't realize we were married over 60 years. I don't want to move on with my life yet. I want to sit here and remember her and feel her spirit and grieve. I need to grieve and I want to grieve. I'll get up when I'm ready." Those were very sage words because we should grieve. We really should so that we can heal. But how do we grieve? How is the best way to grieve? Healthy grieving includes talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and talking. Talking about it, talking about the memories, talking about the pain, talking about the impact. Grief is the one avenue, without a doubt, that gets better through talking about it, sharing stories, sharing it, talk, talk, talk. There's some things you can do that are helpful too. Many times not wanting to let go of grief is because there's a fear of forgetting. So you might want to journal some of your memories, make a photo album. Well, here's a good one. Text messages can't be transferred to another phone. So rather than risk losing them, go ahead and copy them down. Takes a while to sit down with, your document and write down all the different texts, but it can be very healing to review old conversations and then to know that you have a copy, that it won't be lost. Those conversations won't be lost, can be very healthy. Of course, you can do a screenshot too, but I found that just copying the text is actually very healing and helpful. You want to try to immortalize the memory, the spirit. Sight, many people put up pictures of their loved one around the house. That's helpful. Sounds, many people still enjoy listening to the voicemail announcement of their loved one, just to hear the sound of their voice. Smells, perhaps it's your loved one's favorite perfume, deodorant, hairbrush, and how they feel. I was recently introduced to this idea of the memory pillow for young mothers who lose their children to SID, sudden infant death syndrome. You can order this pillow that is the same weight as the infant that they lost, so that when they hold the pillow, it's familiar. It's the same weight as the infant that they lost. You might want to immortalize the memory of your loved one with a plant, a tree that grows, that will flourish and will be a memorial. that you can share and enjoy right in your own area. I know for me, when I lost my stepfather down in Florida, I planted an orange hibiscus like this one in front of his condo. They allowed me to plant that there. And then every year on Father's Day, because he died just a few days after Father's Day, I buy myself a new orange hibiscus and put it out on my deck and enjoy it all summer long in honor of him. It's a way to have an annual tradition because death anniversaries are important to acknowledge. Also, some people enjoy doing traditions like lighting a candle. I know there are even faiths that do that, light a candle for the day, set off a balloon up into the sky. It's important to physically do something that allows you to acknowledge the grief every year and to acknowledge that memory every year, acknowledging the spirit of the person. My dad loved hibiscus, and so when I see them, it reminds me of him and his spirit. So as caregivers specifically, grief recovery includes first grieving, going through the processes that we just discussed about grieving, planting a tree, buying a plant, copying down text messages. And then over time, when you're ready, you'll feel a nudge. Just like that gentleman told me when I went into his home and he said, I'll go out again when I'm ready. You'll know, you'll feel a little nudge. So then you'll be ready to let go a little and then finally be able to rebuild. So when you find that you're not letting go, it's important to examine the motives for why you're not letting go. What is it that's holding you back from letting go? Recognize that urge that I talked about. Quiet the question, why? That's so hard. The if only, the why, the what if. You need time to let those questions quiet. But when you finally do, when they finally reach the point of just because, then you're ready to start letting go. And then it's important to give yourself permission to let go. And rebuilding, setting an intention for change, integrating the old with the new. You will never forget the person that you've lost, that you have loved and lost. You'll never forget them. You will always hang on to them. But the real trick is to integrate the old with the new. Integrate the way you were with them into the way you are as you move forward. And then making new choices, bringing the old with you, but really making new choices about what you do, what you think, controlling those questions, and who you are. The problem is we all get stuck. I don't know if you can see this silly dog of mine with her head stuck in an empty food bag. It must have smelled really good because she was convinced she could get the last few nibbles out of the bottom, but of course she couldn't. And indeed, we do. We do get stuck. And caregivers are at an increased risk for getting stuck. Caregivers are at an increased risk for prolonged or complicated grief. Primarily because we are so invested. Let's start first by looking at just regular grief. Regular grief versus regular depression, right? So with grief, there's an identifiable loss. With depression, you may not even be able to figure out why you're depressed or what the loss is. With grief, your focus is on the loss. With depression, your focus is on yourself, me. With grief, there's a fluctuating ability to feel pleasure. That's when I know that someone is able to grieve healthfully in a way that is healthy. When occasionally you can still laugh, you can still feel pleasure. With depression, there is no pleasure. You're not able to laugh. There may be fluctuating physical symptoms of insomnia, eating too little, eating too much, sleeping too much. But with depression, there is prolonged and marked functional impairment. Here's another clue, whether you're really grieving or are you depressed. Having others close by is comforting. With depression, we want to be alone. We're able to feel, again, a wide range of emotions when we're grieving, but emotions are really fixed and we feel stuck in just one emotion, either anger or sadness when we are depressed. We may express guilt over some aspects of the loss, but with depression, there's a lot of self-blame, a lot of self-deprecating, really, really down on ourselves. Again, that gets back to the focus really being on ourselves. The self-esteem is usually preserved after the loss, but there's this real sense of worthlessness and self-loathing with depression. It's not uncommon to want to be reunited with the person that you've loved when you're grieving. Hopefully not to the point of coming up with a suicide plan, but really feeling like maybe I would be better off being with the loved one through death, versus feeling like you can't cope with the pain when there is depression, or that you don't deserve to keep living. About 10 to 20% of individuals who are grieving experience what's called prolonged or complicated grief. And I believe caregivers are more at risk of this. So that's why I wanted to bring this up. With prolonged and complicated grief, it does not resolve naturally. It does not get better over time, just leaving it alone on its own. It persists for an indefinite period, and it can be much more incapacitating. And it also can have more long-term health effects. With prolonged and complicated grief, it's more than 6 months that we're unable to accept the loss, have these intense feelings of emptiness or loneliness, and unable to experience moments of happiness. So you can see how the depression is intermixed and complicating the grief. Intense feelings of anger, recurrent thoughts that life is meaningless or unfair, a frequent urge to join the deceased in death, and just a whole sense of loss of self. That is how the DSM-5 describes prolonged and complicated grief. It's not uncommon, especially with caregivers. It's not uncommon. But prolonged and complicated grief is much more difficult to recover from. It's not impossible, but it's going to take a little longer and it's going to take a little more intention. And that might be when you want to reach out for some professional help. As much as caregivers are at risk of prolonged and complicated grief, I want to remind you that as a caregiver, you have been coping for quite a while. And you know that as a caregiver, you have learned how to be creative. You have built up a storehouse of knowledge. You are really good at persevering. Really good as a caregiver. You cannot be a caregiver and not persevere. You're aware of your needs, very self-aware. You're resilient. You have come through caregiving. You know how to be an advocate for yourself and for others. You're resourceful, but you're also human. You're all these things as a caregiver. You have all these wonderful strengths that have carried you through each and every challenge of caregiving and will carry you through grief, even complicated and prolonged grief. These resources that are inside you, that you have strengthened as a caregiver, will serve you as you grieve. But please recognize, as a caregiver, you're human. As a caregiver, you're not superhuman. That's going to go for your role as a caregiver, and it's going to go for your experience of grief. You need to remember that you can, but you need to give yourself permission to be human too. As a caregiver, you know there is nothing permanent except change. You have accepted change throughout the caregiving process, and death and grief and embracing the spirit of the person that you have loved and building a legacy around that spirit of who they are is what you're able to do, because you, more than most, are fully aware that Heraclitus is correct. There is nothing permanent except change in life. But you also know you don't have to do it alone. There are resources in your community. You have your medical providers. Call your medical provider. You may or may not need pharmacological intervention to help you be able to process the grief, be able to calm down the emotions enough to be able to process the grief. You have your faith-based and your social communities. This is not the time to isolate. You can't talk and talk and talk and talk if you're by yourself. Reach out to those people. Let them know about your grief. Ask them to help support you in just the way that you asked for help as a caregiver. When my good friend at my church lost her husband, she called me up on Thursday and she said, "Colleen, I'm going to be coming to church on Sunday, but I'm nervous about it. Will you sit with me? That's all I need you to do. Will you sit beside me?" And I did. I sat beside her and I held her hand while she cried, passed her a tissue, and just was willing to be with her so that she wasn't afraid to come into the community that she needed to be in to help with her grief. Reach out, ask for help with your grief. Use your caregiver support group members. Every caregiver support group I have facilitated, people who are grieving, people who have had loss, still come. They still come to the meetings, at least for a while, to provide insight and to gain the support of your support group members that you use to lift you up throughout the whole caregiving process. Same with your caregiver friends and your non-caregiver friends. Your informal resources in the community are hugely important. There are also additional resources for you, like the Aging, Disability, and Caregiver Resources line, and this organization that has facilitated our getting together today. The caregiver specialists that are on there will help you. And you also might want to call for counseling, either through Northern Virginia Older Adult Counseling Center, or you also can call CSB, the Aging, Disability, and Caregiver Resources line, can help you get connected with any of the professional mental health services that are available in our area to support you if you feel that you need that additional help to get through with your grief or with the prolonged and complicated grief that we talked about. So I think pretty much on time and ready for any questions that may have come up.
Thank you, Colleen. Yes, at this time, if you could take, you can submit questions in the panel box. Colleen, we do have a few questions for you already. I'm going to start with. Many times we have heard about the stages of grief, and at times people tend to think that grief is a linear progression. Could you talk about that, the stages of grief?
Yeah, that's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she didn't mean for us to think of it linearly. I can't say it, but but there are stages, and it is important to identify those stages. But it's also important to recognize that you're going to feel all of those all the time as different things come up. You know, processing grief is not static. It's not like building blocks. It really is much more of a process that you're going to go through. And so you're going to go through maybe denial and then the anger and go through, you know, this sadness and then eventually end up with the acceptance, which is kind of what I was describing as the letting go and being able to rebuild. But it's not linear. It's not. It is something that, you know, one step forward, two steps back.
Can you share how a caregiver can self-assess whether they are going through grief?
Sure. So it's not likely that you're not going through any grief. But if you go back and look at the slide on grief versus depression, that's an important one to recognize whether you're grieving and coping in a way that is healthy and that you're on the right track, or if you're starting to slide into that stuck situation where you really can't get out of it and may need some professional help, as well as the slides. That's why I gave the actual definitions of the complicated and prolonged grief, because it is very common, and much more so for caregivers, because we have so much more invested on a daily basis. Even if you're a long distance caregiver, we have so much more invested in the relationship that it is a much bigger loss.
Thank you. Could you talk about the difference between attending individual therapy versus support groups?
Sure. So support groups are great because you're able to learn in a support group, just like you did through caregiving, ideas that have worked for other people, strategies that might be helpful to you, connect with other people who are grieving so you know that you're not going through it alone. Those are great, and those are really valuable, I would say, for everyone who is experiencing grief. But if you find that you are getting stuck in the depression mode, where your focus is more on you, me, what I'm going through, me, I can't get out of this, I'm not able to experience joy. If you find yourself getting into that depression mode, if it's going on too long, lasting longer than 6 months of really incapacitating, and you find yourself in that prolonged or complicated grief, then I think you're better. Then you really may want to consider the individual therapy where you can process your specific situation in more detail, because a lot of times what's causing the prolonged and complicated grief is other factors that are unique to you. And so you'll want to be able to process those on a more individual basis.
Thank you. It's difficult to approach someone who's grieving sometimes, and it's hard to know what to say to them. What are some tips or suggestions that you can, say to someone like a caregiver who's grieving?
Yes. So I don't know that there's much you can say, but there's a lot you can ask. So you can say, I'm sorry for your loss. And then you can ask, is there anything that I can do to help you with your grief? I would love to hear more about it. Can you share a little bit about it? You can ask a little bit about the spirit of the person that they lost, as we, and provide opportunities for them to talk. basically make it okay to talk by inviting those discussions, by saying things like, oh, wouldn't dad have loved, you know, this kind of ice cream, or wouldn't mom have really enjoyed watching this movie? Helping to keep the legacy, the spirit of that person alive is even more important, I think, than just asking, what can I do to help? You know what that's like as a caregiver. And the same thing continues on into grief. But to be able to say, you know, how are you doing? I really want to know. And I know I'm really sad and still grieving. And just making it okay for a person to be grieving.
Mm-hmm. When you're caregiving for someone who's coming near death, is it normal to start grieving before they even pass away?
Yes, that's called anticipatory grief. You see it coming, you know it's coming. Sometimes anticipatory grief can be helpful because by the time the person passes, you've already grieved them, and it can make grieving a little bit easier. So you don't want to feel guilty if you don't fall apart when the person dies and you've already grieved them with anticipatory grief. But that definitely can happen as it gets closer. And that also can kind of be a clue for you as to how well you think you might be prepared to deal with the grief. And so maybe looking for a grief support group in advance, kind of lining up, talking to your doctor in advance, you know, this is something that I'm going through, that I know it's coming up. Just trying to be an advocate for yourself.
Would you say it's normal for a caregiver to feel angry and feeling resentment all at the same time?
Sure it is. Sure, it is so common to feel anger and resentment, even in the caregiving situation, and then to kind of feel a deflated sense of, what was that all for? We kind of, as caregivers, get caught up in thinking that if we just do the right thing, we can save the person and keep the person from dying. And so it can even almost feel like, I really didn't want you to die. It's been my goal for so long to keep you alive. And it's hard to accept that they're gone without that kind of resentment and anger. And even kind of feeling it at oneself, like, why couldn't I do it? Which isn't really rational, but it's how we feel.
I have another question from the audience, Colleen. If a person is grieving for over 1 or 2 years, is that the complicated prolonged grieving?
It is. Depending on what you mean by their grieving for 1 or 2 years. If the person is still missing their loved one, thinking about their loved one, maybe even talking out loud to their loved one a year or 2 out, there's nothing wrong with that. But how much is that grief incapacitating your daily living? How much is that keeping you from being engaged with other people and the other important activities of your life? That's really the question. If 1 to 2 years out, you're still pretty immobilized, that's the prolonged and complicated grief.
A follow-up question to that is that when you would say it requires individual therapy?
I would. Yeah, that's when you want to try to get some help, because it's really hard to get unstuck after a year or 2. It really is.
Another question is, when you're feeling anger during the grief, how do you not let the anger hurt people around you? How do you not react to others in your life?
I don't know that you can. I don't know that you can. You're gonna lash out any more than you can avoid lashing out in your caregiver role. You try to curb it as best as you can. You know, but sometimes angry words pop out. We get impatient. It's gonna happen. But hopefully it's you know, you keep it as in control as you can. And I don't know, beat up a pillow. I mean, it is natural. Like I said, we are pack animals. We are meant to be attached. Detaching is hurtful, and we don't like it, and it doesn't feel fair. And so that anger is going to come up. It's not wrong to feel anger. It's what you do with the anger. That's really the thing. So you're going to feel angry. It's just, if you find yourself lashing out at other people when you do, just got to go back and make amends. You got to go back and say, I'm sorry. I'm just really hurting.
We have another question. How do I avoid feeling like I haven't done enough for my loved one, or like I have let my loved one down, even when I've known I've done my best?
Right. That's what I was talking about, where as a caregiver, it's so easy to get caught up in the responsibility of providing care and knowing that you're keeping them alive. Right? I'm the one that's going to call the doctor when things change. I'm the one that's going to make sure that they have everything that they need. And you can do all of that. But when the time comes, it's still going to come. And it feels like, if only. It feels like I didn't want this to happen. I worked so hard to avoid this. But the reality is, sooner or later, the passing of your loved one is beyond your control. It just is beyond your control. You can do everything you can for as long as you can, but the body wears out and there is only so much you can do. You know, and it's so easy to second guess. If only we had a crystal ball, wouldn't it be nice? We could make all kinds of perfect decisions if we had that crystal ball, but we don't. So we do the best that we can. And so you just have to remind yourself too that whatever decisions you made while you were providing the care, you were working with the best information that you had. That's all you had to work with. If only, sure, but that it's, you know, there's no way to know the if only until after the fact.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. We're going to get ready to wrap up. As you sign out, there will be a brief survey. Please take a moment to answer those questions and help us provide topics that you are interested in. I also want to invite you to sign up for our next caregiver webinar on Wednesday, September 22nd. The topic will be on preparing for the increased cost of caregiving. Colleen, thank you so much for the valuable information and for giving us your time and your knowledge. And to everyone in our audience, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.